Nancy Pelosi, just called Senator John Kennedy, the senator who thinks a congressional hearing is a crawfish boil in front of 6 million live viewers, delivering the calculated insult with the precise, meticulously calibrated voice she has utilized for 39 years to make powerful men feel instantaneously small. She had, however, selected the absolute wrong target for this particular execution because the old man from Louisiana, whom she had just casually dismissed as a provincial relic, was a Vanderbilt magna cum laude graduate, a University of Virginia law alumnus, an Oxford-trained legal scholar, and a 5-term state treasurer. He absorbed the insult, let the heavy silence stretch across the mahogany tables, and simply laughed a terrifyingly patient sound. He withdrew a crisp handkerchief, began slowly and methodically cleaning his slightly oversized glasses, and then delivered a single, devastating sentence that 6 million people will remember far longer than anything the former speaker has said in nearly 4 decades of public service. From the exact second, the gallery exploded into genuine shocked laughter and subsequently realized the question was not actually a joke. Nancy Pelosi understood the fundamental shift in the room's architecture. The metaphorical crawfish boil had just become a federal courtroom, and she was unequivocally the defendant. She had looked across the dais and seen a folksy, bumbling old man entirely missing the reality that he was an apex predator of an Oxford-trained lawyer, perfectly executing a folksy accent. The catastrophic difference between who she arrogantly assumed he was and who he actually is could be measured exactly, and that difference was $649 million, a staggeringly colossal mathematical discrepancy she will never be able to fully explain. The hearing was exactly 11 minutes old, and up until that precise moment, Nancy Pelosi was in absolute, unquestioned control. She had been commanding rooms exactly like this one for 39 unbroken years, acting as the undisputed apex of congressional authority, a woman who had brutally managed fractured Democratic caucuses, mercilessly pushed the notoriously complex Affordable Care Act through a violently hostile Congress, stared down 4 separate American presidents without blinking, and famously torn a State of the Union address perfectly in half on live television, only to ruthlessly turn that single theatrical gesture into a devastating fundraising email that netted $8 million in 48 hours. Nancy Pelosi did not simply enter rooms, she acquired them, bent them to her will, and completely owned the narrative within them. And this particular hearing room, convened by the Judiciary Committee to discuss congressional stock trading reform, was entirely hers, long before she even took her seat. Densely packed with senators she had systemically outlasted, outmaneuvered, and massively outfunded for 4 decades. Her opening statement was a masterclass in vintage Pelosi procedure, a flawless 6-minute delivery of precise, polished rhetoric infused with the controlled fury of an elite operative who firmly believes that her pristine public record speaks for itself and deeply resents being subjected to the indignity of having to speak for it again. She aggressively declared that she supported reform, insisting she had always been the vanguard of reform, boldly reminding the room that the original Stock Act was the law of the land solely because of her legislative muscle, and noting that the so-called Pelosi Act was steadily moving through the congressional apparatus with her full, unmitigated endorsement. She stated emphatically that she had absolutely nothing to hide, emphasizing that her presence was entirely voluntary and effectively daring any sitting member of the committee to suggest otherwise. Senator John Kennedy was next in the queue, seated 4 chairs down the heavy wooden dais behind a brass nameplate that simply read Louisiana, wearing glasses that were slightly too large for his face and a necktie that hung just slightly too loose against his collar. He looked exactly as he always looked, projecting the disarming aura of a tired man who had accidentally wandered into a high-stakes congressional hearing straight from a weekend fishing trip and was not entirely sure which specific oversight committee he was actually addressing. Pelosi, with her decades of ruthless political survival instincts, should have known better than to take the bait. She had navigated the treacherous waters of Washington long enough to recognize the carefully curated costume, the weaponized folksy drawl, the feigned squinting confusion, and the meticulously crafted rhetorical question that sounds like it was casually tossed from a southern front porch, but lands with the devastating kinetic impact of a seasoned prosecutor's indictment. She undoubtedly knew Kennedy was not a simpleton, but in the brutal calculus of Capitol Hill, knowing a truth and actively respecting it are vastly different paradigms, and Nancy Pelosi had never genuinely respected anyone who voluntarily chose to project an image less powerful than their actual capability. She made her fatal miscalculation entirely unforced, acting entirely on hubris before Kennedy even opened his mouth to speak. When the committee chairman formally turned the floor over to the Louisiana senator, Pelosi leaned deliberately toward her microphone, not to speak directly into the instrument, but to be amplified by it, adopting the exact posture of a dominant figure who wants the entire room to feel the sheer weight of her condescension. She sighed heavily. A sound engineered to convey utter exhaustion with the proceedings, and stated that she hoped the senator from Louisiana possessed a question that did not sound like it originated from a rural county fair, sharply reminding him that this was the United States Senate and explicitly not a crawfish boil. The resulting laughter from the room was immediate, but it was not the warm, shared laughter of a group enjoying a genuinely good-natured joke. It was the sharp, nervous, inherently sycophantic laughter of a room actively watching a supremely powerful woman publicly diminish a junior colleague and effortlessly get away with it simply because she was Nancy Pelosi. Kennedy did not flinch, frown, or retreat. Instead, he smiled the slow, wide, deeply terrifying bayou smile of a predator who has just been voluntarily handed the exact vulnerability he spent months hunting for. He slowly removed his oversized glasses, reached into the breast pocket of his suit to extract a cotton handkerchief, and began cleaning the polycarbonate lenses with agonizingly slow, deliberate, circular motions, utilizing the physical gesture exactly the way a master trial lawyer uses silence to force every single person in the massive room to wait in suspended anticipation. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with Southern hospitality, politely thanking her for the invitation to the county fair, earnestly declaring his profound love for such events, and wistfully detailing the presence of funnel cakes, the ring toss, and the classic game where patrons guess the exact weight of a livestock pig. He paused, letting the absurd imagery settle over the stark mahogany room before slipping the glasses back onto his face as the hospitality vanished from his tone, replaced by cold steel. He explained that at the county fair, the specific phenomenon that had occurred to her family's seemingly miraculous finances was colloquially referred to as getting took, painting the picture of a gullible patron walking in with $100, walking out with a cheap teddy bear and zero cash, and having absolutely no idea how the transaction occurred. The silence in the room became absolute as he delivered the rhetorical kill shot, noting that in her specific case, the exact opposite had magically occurred. Her family had walked into the United States Congress with a modest $610,000 and had somehow managed to walk out with an incomprehensible $649 million, and remarkably, absolutely nobody in Washington seemed to know how that miraculous financial alchemy had happened either. The gallery violently erupted, abandoning decorum entirely with the full-throated, echoing explosion of a room that had just witnessed a man absorb a calculated, deeply condescending insult and immediately return it with devastating, publicly verifiable compound interest. In the chaotic 3 seconds of genuine uproar before the chairman could aggressively gavel the room back into order, Kennedy smoothly opened a battered manila folder, the exact same unpretentious analog folder he brought to every single oversight hearing, which deceptively looked as though it contained mundane grocery lists, but predictably never did. Kennedy explicitly did not utilize a sleek laptop or reference a glowing digital tablet. He relied entirely on physical paper, weaponizing heavily highlighted printed pages, margin sections covered in dense handwritten legal notes, and multicolored tabs marked with neon post-it flags applied with the surgical precision of an investigator who knows exactly which specific page contains the numeric data point that will irreversibly end a career. He resumed his questioning, perfectly re-engaging the folksy disguise, humbly declaring that he was nowhere near as financially sophisticated as her venture capitalist husband, noting he didn't possess the sheer intellectual magnitude to aggressively trade complex options on Nvidia or brilliantly acquire Tempest AI stock right before it magically tripled in value. He claimed to be nothing more than a simple country lawyer from the swamps of Louisiana, but he noted with razor-sharp articulation that even a country lawyer could read a federally mandated Stock Act filing, and he had some very specific, highly legally perilous questions regarding not the trades themselves, but the critical filing dates associated with them. He reminded the room that the Federal Stock Act explicitly requires the full public disclosure of all congressional stock trades within a strict 45-day window, staring directly at Pelosi and weaponizing her own legislative history against her by deliberately pointing out that the Congresswoman herself had forcefully voted for that exact piece of legislation. He then pressed his index finger firmly onto a heavily highlighted page in his folder and began reading her husband's official filing dates into the permanent congressional record. Visa trade manually executed on July 1st, 2024. Official legal disclosure filed an astonishing 67 days later, brazenly violating the 45-day federal requirement and landing exactly 22 days late. Highly lucrative Nvidia options successfully executed in November 2023, legally disclosed 52 days later, comfortably 7 days past the federal deadline. Massive Tempest AI options executed in January 2025, disclosed an incredible 89 days later, a staggering 44 days late. He slowly looked up from the battered folder, the physical numbers hanging in the air like a localized storm front, and smoothly transitioned from federal law to a deeply humanizing narrative, introducing the committee to a personal friend of his named Earl Thibido. He described Earl with vivid, undeniable authenticity, a 63-year-old blue-collar plumber from Baton Rouge who had been breaking his back fixing residential pipes since he was 25 years old, whose entire life savings consisted of a modest $180,000 carefully parked in a standard 401k, cautiously invested in conservative blue-chip stocks like Visa entirely because his local financial advisor at Edward Jones had earnestly promised him it was a fundamentally safe asset. Kennedy let the image of the working-class plumber marinate in the minds of the multimillionaire senators before delivering the contrast. Earl Thibido, an honest American taxpayer, had once filed his federal income taxes exactly 3 days late, and for that minor administrative infraction, the Internal Revenue Service had immediately and ruthlessly fined him $340, which Earl paid without complaint because he follows the established rules and does not possess a heavily armed team of elite corporate lawyers to aggressively argue with the federal government on his behalf. The juxtaposition was blindingly stark, perfectly architected to resonate with every single American holding a modest retirement account. Kennedy spelled out the inescapable reality. The former speaker's husband had casually filed a legally mandated disclosure 89 days late on a complex, highly leveraged options trade that generated millions of dollars in personal profit, while a Baton Rouge plumber filed his taxes a mere 3 days late and got hit with a devastating financial penalty. Kennedy stared through his lenses, his voice dropping an octave, and asked a fundamental question regarding the American justice system. Who exactly is the Stock Act meant to police? Working-class men like Earl, or the ruling class exactly like her husband? Pelosi's survival instincts triggered instantly as she aggressively reached for her microphone, her movements fast, procedural, and heavily controlled, firmly declaring that Senator Kennedy was mistaken and that all Stock Act filing requirements were meticulously met by her congressional office in strict accordance with the law. Kennedy violently severed her sentence, his Bayou drawl momentarily vanishing to reveal the razor-sharp blade beneath, stating with icy precision that 67 days is mathematically not 45 days, mocking his own public school education while noting he possessed the rudimentary arithmetic skills necessary to subtract. He then escalated the stakes from mere administrative oversight to potential felony criminal liability, citing Section 105 of the Federal Stock Act from memory, explicitly detailing that the willful violation of the disclosure timeline carries a catastrophic statutory penalty of up to $50,000 in fines and up to 1 full year in federal prison per individual violation. He counted the offenses on his fingers for the cameras. 3 distinct late filings deeply buried in a 2-year operational window, legally constituting 3 potential prosecutable violations that could mean a fortune in fines and 3 years in prison. For Earl the plumber, 3 days late on a modest tax return cost $340 out of pocket. For her deeply entrenched husband, 89 days late on a multi-million-dollar stock trade resulted in absolutely nothing. He removed his glasses and began cleaning them again, the aggressively repeated gesture rapidly becoming a psychological clock that dropped the ambient temperature in the cavernous hearing room another 10 degrees every time those oversized polycarbonate lenses came off his face. Kennedy's voice underwent a permanent structural shift, the thick, folksy drawl forcefully moving aside to definitively reveal the chilling, unmistakable voice of a man who had conquered the academic rigors of Virginia Law School and Oxford, knowing exactly how to construct a perfectly balanced sentence that functioned simultaneously as an innocent legislative question and a devastating legal charge. He looked directly at the former speaker and noted that her congressional office utilized a highly standardized, rigorously vetted public relations response that he had practically memorized, quoting verbatim that Speaker Pelosi explicitly does not own any stocks whatsoever and maintains absolutely no prior knowledge or subsequent operational involvement in any of her husband's financial transactions. He paused, publicly acknowledging that her carefully crafted defense was technically legally correct, conceding the premise that she does not legally own the stocks. He does before the glasses came off again. The handkerchief reappeared, and Kennedy unleashed the metaphor that would fundamentally break the hearing by leaning forward and asking, "Do you genuinely need to own the cow in order to drink the massive volumes of milk?" The gallery, already wound to a breaking point, exploded once again as the brutal, inescapable logic ripped straight from the highest echelons of corporate law school washed over the room, ensuring every single politically astute person intuitively understood both layers of meaning simultaneously. The proverbial cow was undeniably Paul Pelosi's sprawling, multi-hundred-million-dollar investment portfolio. The milk was the $649 million in shared, unmitigated generational wealth they both actively enjoyed. And the question, cleverly disguised as a folksy joke about Southern dairy farming, was in reality the exact lethal legal standard that the Securities and Exchange Commission relentlessly applies in every single spousal benefit insider trading enforcement case in the nation. Pelosi's jaw visibly set. A microscopic physical expression of suppressed rage from a supremely powerful woman who fundamentally cannot decide whether to be deeply offended by the sheer audacity of the farm animal metaphor or absolutely terrified by its undeniable legal accuracy. Kennedy did not allow her a moment to process the danger, accelerating and hammering the SEC logic home with merciless precision, reminding her that she currently resides in an opulent home valued at upwards of $25 million, directly paid for by the astronomical profits generated by those very stock trades. He introduced devastating comparative data into the congressional record, noting that her husband's actively managed portfolio had returned well over 180% since the exact day she entered the United States Congress, systematically comparing that staggering yield to the broader S&P 500, which had returned a comparatively meager 100% during that exact same historical period. He crystallized the indictment, stating she continuously claims she does not own the individual stocks, but she undeniably materially owns the extravagant, untouchable life that those specific stocks meticulously built, explaining that the fundamental legal inquiry the Stock Act was originally drafted to explicitly address is whether a powerful individual who heavily benefits from highly timed trades should be legally treated any differently from the individual actually executing them on a terminal. Kennedy methodically turned to the very back of his battered folder, gripping the bright, aggressive red post-it flag that served as a psychological weapon, and shifted his focus to the impossible timing of the transactions. He stated with venomous sarcasm that her husband's sprawling investment portfolio possessed a truly remarkable, almost supernatural gift of consistently knowing deeply impactful, highly classified things, days, weeks, and months, before the broader financial market ever discovered them. He countered any defense of financial genius with his own devastating rural logic, explaining that he personally raises chickens down in Louisiana, and when one of his chickens miraculously knows a torrential thunderstorm is coming long before the Weather Channel detects it, he does not for a single second assume the chicken is a certified meteorologist, but assumes with absolute certainty that somebody actively told the chicken the rain was coming. He unleashed the numbers rapid fire and lethal. July 2024. Paul Pelosi aggressively dumps 2,000 shares of Visa, and exactly 85 days later, the Department of Justice suddenly sues Visa for massive antitrust violations, causing the stock to plummet. December 2022, Paul Pelosi quietly offloads 30,000 heavily valued shares of Google, and exactly 1 month later, the DOJ launches a historic antitrust lawsuit against Google. January 2025, Paul Pelosi heavily buys highly speculative Tempest AI options, and within 30 short days, the virtually unknown stock skyrockets from $35 to $89. Kennedy brought the devastation back to Main Street, noting Earl Thibido had Visa anchored in his modest 401k and watched $2,800 evaporate on the exact day the DOJ sued the credit giant, entirely because Earl does not have the profound luxury of eating supper every night with the former Speaker of the House. Kennedy escalated the assault, citing a massive peer-reviewed study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, conclusively finding that top congressional leaders systematically outperform their civilian peers in the stock market by up to 47%, letting that staggering statistic echo against the mahogany walls to prove it is undeniably the execution of highly classified market-moving information. He leaned entirely across the dais, locking eyes with Pelosi, and asked the defining question of the decade, "Who told the chicken, ma'am?" The sheer magnitude of the accusation hung suspended in the hyper-conditioned air of the hearing room. 5 simple words wrapped elegantly in an absurd chicken metaphor, but violently vibrating with the precise, lethal legal question that every single SEC enforcement attorney aggressively asks in every federal insider trading investigation. Was there a verifiable source of material, non-public information? Pelosi, backed into a corner she had never occupied in 39 years, completely abandoned any attempt to answer the substance of the question, defaulting purely to procedural defense mechanisms by aggressively reaching for the microphone and loudly demanding a formal point of order to declare Kennedy was engaging in wild, baseless speculation. But Kennedy refused to be silenced, talking directly over her with the booming authority of a judge, stating that asking who told the chicken is legally not speculation. It is a direct, fundamental question. When that specific metaphorical chicken just magically made $649 million, while the rest of America went broke. Kennedy ruthlessly turned to the final tab in his folder, announcing to the silent room that he wanted to explicitly move away from the investment portfolio and directly address her husband's other highly publicized extracurricular activities to determine if her elite family operates under the exact same set of legal rules as Earl Thibido's family. He read the police blotter with the cold, detached precision of a coroner. A 2022 devastating DUI in Napa County where Paul Pelosi blew a blood alcohol content of .082 after violently striking another citizen's vehicle, resulting in a quiet misdemeanor plea for 5 days of lenient community service, followed by an ongoing law enforcement investigation into a chaotic hit-and-run incident occurring exactly 13 days prior to this very hearing. He stated in a dangerous, quiet whisper that he was absolutely not bringing up these deeply humiliating criminal incidents simply to embarrass her aging husband, but explicitly because of the massive $50 million Nancy Pelosi Institute for Representative Democracy she is currently building at UC Berkeley to lecture the next generation of Americans on political ethics. Kennedy stared through her, abandoning the folksy facade entirely to summarize the sheer, incomprehensible hypocrisy of her existence. Noting her husband possesses a highly publicized DUI conviction, is being actively investigated for a hit and run, mathematically outperforms every single elite hedge fund in America. And she sits before the Senate claiming she absolutely does not know a single thing about any of it while building an ethics institute proudly named directly after herself. He delivered the final devastating indictment of her career, stating that the pristine legacy she is desperately trying to build and the corrupt, scandal-ridden record she is actually leaving behind are fundamentally not the same building. And at some inevitable point in the future, some bright student is going to walk into her $50 million ethics institute, open a federal Stock Act filing, look at the impossible timeline of her family's wealth, and ask exactly who told the chicken. Pelosi fired back with pristine, rehearsed hostility, sharply declaring that folksy entertainment absolutely does not constitute legal evidence, forcefully insisting her family's massive finances are fully disclosed, completely legal, and 100% transparent. She aggressively invited him to refer any actual evidence to the appropriate federal enforcement authorities and sternly announced she considered this deeply insulting line of questioning definitively closed. A masterful vintage Pelosi response delivered with the crushing authority of an apex predator that prompted her panicked staff to immediately begin drafting the video clip for social media dissemination. Kennedy slowly nodded the deeply unsettling, highly calculated nod of an elite chess player who has just heard the exact desperately defensive answer he fully expected to hear and is now going to methodically explain precisely why that specific answer is the ultimate trap. He politely noted she had just used the phrase fully transparent on the congressional record and announced he simply wanted to rapidly test the absolute validity of that transparency with exactly one final question revolving around exactly one specific number. He laid out the timeline with brutal, unassailable arithmetic. Her family first entered Congress in 1987, possessing an estimated net worth fluctuating around $610,000, and her estimated net worth sitting in the chair today is an incomprehensible $649 million. Her official taxpayer-funded congressional salary over those exact 39 years, generously calculated, totals a mere $8.7 million, and $649 million minus $8.7 million mathematically equals exactly $640 million in completely unexplained astronomical wealth. He looked directly at her, weaponizing the undeniable math, and asked the ultimate unanswerable question exactly the way a highly lethal corporate lawyer asks a cornered witness. "Ma'am, where exactly did $640 million magically come from?" He leaned forward, twisting the knife by reminding her that she had just proudly declared herself to be fully transparent, and that specific gargantuan number is the ultimate transparency test. The unfinished sentence hung suspended in the dead silence of the committee room, like an open, highly radioactive federal indictment, because the cold, hard reality was that the genuine answer is either highly leveraged, impeccably timed stock trades based on classified data, meaning the spousal loophole is a direct confession of insider trading, or the former Speaker of the House is claiming she completely lost track of $640 million, both of which belong squarely at the county fair. For the very first time in that grueling hearing, Nancy Pelosi was entirely, completely silent, trapped by a basic arithmetic question she fundamentally could not solve without legally incriminating herself. Kennedy slowly closed his battered manila folder, carefully tucked his white handkerchief back into his breast pocket, and casually straightened his slightly loose tie, politely thanking her, formally yielding back his time, and offering a highly sarcastic parting apology for the crawfish boil metaphor, while noting that at least at a Louisiana crawfish boil, the people absolutely know exactly what they are paying for. In the chaotic, highly destructive 72 hours immediately following the hearing, the internet rapidly crystallized the destruction into 3 distinct viral video clips aggressively targeting 3 entirely different American audiences. The cow clip, functionally asking if you need to own the cow to drink the milk, rapidly amassed 23 million views because it was simultaneously hilarious to the layman and devastatingly accurate to elite corporate lawyers who universally understood it as the exact literal standard the SEC utilizes for federal insider trading. The chicken clip exploded to 19 million views, violently spawning an uncontrollable internet meme culture within hours where "Who Told the Chicken" became the universally understood shorthand summary of absolutely every single congressional stock trading scandal, complete with merchandise and a dedicated TikTok account mathematically dismantling financial disclosures. The devastating math clip, featuring Kennedy calmly deducting her salary from her net worth to expose the missing $640 million, garnered 14 million views and directly infiltrated serious finance media, aggressive retirement planning forums, and the highly specific network of middle-class Americans who painfully know how functionally impossible it is to accumulate that wealth without possessing classified, market-moving information. The institutional collapse occurred in rapid, highly predictable stages, beginning in week 1 with Pelosi's panicked Congressional office releasing a highly sanitized 4-sentence defensive statement that aggressively attempted to dismiss Kennedy's questions as folksy theater while entirely failing to address the 89-day late filings, the glaring spousal loophole, or the missing hundreds of millions of dollars. Almost immediately, the Federal Election Commission officially opened a formal, highly publicized review of Paul Pelosi's specific Stock Act filing dates, heavily focusing on the exact 3 late disclosures Kennedy had read aloud to determine if they were legally willful violations carrying devastating statutory penalties. Simultaneously, Senator Rick Scott brilliantly utilized the massive viral momentum to formally push through a comprehensive Government Accountability Office audit of congressional trading patterns, explicitly utilizing the Pelosi family's specific filings as the primary highly scrutinized case study. By week 2, the Securities and Exchange Commission quietly issued an explosive, highly technical guidance memo explicitly clarifying that the Stock Act's strict disclosure requirements absolutely apply in full to the expansive financial interests of the filer's spouse, definitively answering Kennedy's folksy cow question in the affirmative and obliterating her legal defense. Within 48 hours, Paul Pelosi's elite legal team, scrambled to file a massive, entirely voluntary amended disclosure document covering absolutely all trades from 2023 to 2026, desperately correcting previous filing dates in a panicked act that served as a devastating permanent public admission that their records had absolutely not been fully compliant. By week three massive institutional donors formally requested a hard pause on all funding transfers for the Nancy Pelosi Institute, coldly citing reputational concerns. The exact same two devastating words that elite Wall Street firms had quietly used just months prior to permanently pull the highly scrutinized Pelosi Tracker ETF from their lucrative recommended investment lists. The highly damaging hit-and-run investigation aggressively continued in California, forming an impenetrable, highly toxic narrative pattern placed side by side with the previous DUI conviction, the impossibly timed stock trades, and the unanswerable math question that proved this elite, untouchable family fundamentally operated in an entirely different version of America than the one Earl Thibido was forced to live in. Earl quietly sat in his living room in Baton Rouge, watching a senator finally ask the exact same desperate, deeply angry question he had been endlessly asking his wife at their worn kitchen table for 2 solid years about why the elite never get in trouble while working-class citizens get ruthlessly fined.
Painfully proving that until somebody violently tears open the sealed federal filings under oath, the political chickens will continuously keep getting richer. Kennedy quietly went back to Louisiana, entirely refusing to go on television to cash in on the viral moment, opting instead to feed his actual chickens in the suffocating southern heat and patiently wait for the battered manila folder to slowly fill itself back up. But on a quiet Tuesday evening, Kennedy pulled a newly delivered, heavily sealed federal envelope from his mail stack, tracing a previously completely unknown shell company domiciled in Delaware, and slowly opened the rigid flap to slide out a heavily redacted classified banking ledger that made him instantly freeze. The astronomical numbers aligned perfectly with a highly classified Senate Defense Appropriation Committee briefing, acting as a devastating map that led to a single,
terrifying name scribbled in blue ink at the bottom of the page that had absolutely nothing to do with Nancy Pelosi, but everything to do with the highest executive office in the nation, prompting Kennedy to reach for his telephone and coldly whisper into the receiver that they were going to need a much bigger folder.